a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, shapeshifters, self-inventors, and reinventors, role players, and fictional characters. I'm Grant Faulkner, a person who feels himself and life at least partly fictional. And I'm with my co-host, Brooke Warner. And Brooke, I want to say that I feel like a trend of self-perception and self-expression might be underfoot. And it seems to primarily have to do with women, although I think it applies to us all. And I want to pass this theory by you based on a series of guests we've had on who have discussed what I'll call the fictionality or the versionality of self. Lydia Yuknavitch discussed shapeshifting and reframing stories in her memoir. Jill Cement literally rewrote her first memoir about marrying her teacher after an affair, and that was in her second memoir, Consent. And beyond that, Monica Lewinsky has a podcast about reclaiming herself, changing the narrative or the nightmare that shaped her during and after her affair with Bill Clinton. And then today we're talking with Nicole Graev Lipson about her collection of essays, Mothers and Other Fictional Characters, which forefronts the fictionality of mothers and other women's roles in the very title of the book. And so I think our conception of self, was largely determined, our contemporary conception of self, largely determined by the advent of psychology and therapy. For most of the 20th century, we thought a lot about our unconscious lives and the way our parents, mothers in particular, perhaps shaped us into a self or a personality. But that cultural and intellectual trend might be morphing into something else now, I think, like the self as story, I suppose, the changing self, that is a story told by others and a story also told by yourself, and somehow we have to reconcile the two. So what do you think? Do we have an intellectual trend going, or am I making this all up?
No, I'm nodding along. You said cultural trend, and that resonates more maybe, though maybe many or most cultural trends are in fact intellectual trends. I think basically what we're seeing is an era of writers asserting that collectively, we want more freedom of expression. For years and years, for as long as I've been in publishing, and certainly for the decades plus that I've been teaching memoir, all the way up until pretty recently, there's been very rigid boxes. This is how you do this genre, right? And MFA programs made a lot of money teaching writers a certain way to write and express. And so the trend I'm seeing, I think, really took off during the pandemic and has only continued, if not exploded. It's a move toward the blurring of the lines. We've talked about this a lot, blurring between fiction and reality on the one hand, but also a real freedom of expression that says, I want to explore something. And then the way I explore it doesn't need to be confined to a particular form or narrative. So it's these two things. Like, one is how we're thinking about self-expression, and the other is the way that we are actually expressing it on the page. So that's my observation, but I would love to hear you say more about this idea of fictionality of self.
Definitely, in the sense that we are, I think, the stories we tell ourselves, our stories are our psychology, but we also live out the stories that are told about us. And I'm very interested in this, especially in terms of, growing up in a small town where the definitions of man, boy, woman, girl, father, mother, they're very rigidly defined. You're born into a whole series of expectations. And I think it's hard to break out of those expectations. And sometimes those expectations or conventions just seep into you, you absorb them unconsciously. So you need to take a lot of long reflective walks or undergo therapy or write a memoir or all of the above to even kind of identify them. And, now that I've lived most of my life in an urban setting, it's just much more easy to be anonymous here, obviously. And so we can escape being the creations of other people, maybe a little more easily. And I often think of Jean-Paul Sartre's play, No Exit. And one character's famous statement is, hell is other people. and hell is other people's judgments and their expectations, their confinements that they put upon you. And I think this is why we need art, to help us deconstruct those roles. And I think of the photographer Cindy Sherman, whose work consists, primarily of all these like amazing self-portraits in which she depicts herself in different contexts and as various imagined characters. She's taken photos of herself evoking, female roles in popular B movies. And then she's also, appropriated a number of other visual forms, such as the centerfold, the fashion photograph, the historical portrait, and then, softcore sex images, all that kind of highlight the roles that women fill or are expected to fill. So I'm curious what you think, Brooke, when you think of an artist or writer probing these roles, different roles of self, or these multiplicities of self.
Yeah, I love it. Last week when we interviewed Jill Cement, I asked her about this idea of multiple selves. And I don't know that everyone considers the self in this way. And Jill's answer actually made me feel like maybe she didn't. But I got to thinking about the concept, of course, because many writers do think about it. And Annie Ernaux in particular writes this way, about the young girl that she was. And often she'll write about the young self in the third person. And then she grapples with the changes over time. And she's finding these ways to embody different perspectives in her prose in really beautiful and interesting ways. But that question that I posed to Jill was really stemming from my own writing, because I'm writing about a past relationship, a past marriage, and I can see that I'm not always my best self in that role. I can do the self-interrogation that we've talked about, and I think I can and do present a flawed character, me. My ex is flawed, of course, too. And we're looking to paint these realistic portraits in memoir. But who I am as a mother to my son, that's a different role, and I show up differently. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, but boy, am I less flawed in that role, at least in my own perception, than I am as an ex-partner. And so this is all of what we're grappling with as writers in our efforts to show the many sides of self on the page. But of course, we're one single integrated human. Memoirists only have one life, as far as I know. And so the portrait analogy is really interesting, actually. I suppose there are as many ways to render ourselves on the page as there are potential photo shoots we might take of ourselves, right, in any stage of life. So I like that image.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we have this fundamental human desire to be seen and understood. And I think it can be horribly painful to feel misunderstood, especially by a loved one. And there is just something so primal about this need to be seen for who we are. And at the same time, though, we all somehow sacrifice or compromise that truth of who we are to some degree. I think it's interesting, for example, how Nicole mentioned in an interview, this is a quote from her: "I wanted to challenge these reductive stories, yes, but even more, I wanted to explore how easy it is for us as women to be complicit in their telling, erasing our own complexity as we step into fictional versions of who we are." And that complicity in being someone we're not is, I think, maybe as painful as being misunderstood. One area where I think she really uncovers a truth that's hidden under gender perception is female friendship. It was really an amazing, fascinating, probing essay and insightful. It's called The Friendship Plot. And she riffs on the movie Mean Girls and other stories that present women and girls being cliquish and mean together. And she mentions how when girls form friendships, they're often described as cliquey. And she compares the word clique with coven. But when boys do so, they're called buddies. and male friendship is kind of celebrated and female friendship is somehow suspect. And she even tells a story about a camp counselor who called her about her daughter having a secret language with some friends who were all inseparable at camp. And it turned out that her daughter hadn't done anything wrong or bad. The camp counselor was just calling to say that she's close with her friends, and that was suspect, and they weren't being mean at all. So Nicole even daydreams about another kind of call in another world from this counselor who would say, "I have some good news. Leah's formed deep friendships with 3 girls in particular. She's experiencing what it means to choose and be chosen, to know and be known." It's just like recasts the whole clique of Mean Girls. And so I'm curious, Brooke, have you experienced this or witnessed this type of stereotyping yourself?
Yeah, I have experienced, of course, lots of stereotyping in my life, seen it play out, ideas of what women should be, specific to motherhood for sure. I felt it in my work life and in relationships. But interestingly, it's funny, I was thinking not so much of my own friendships. Female friendship has been an area where historically I've really thrived, where I haven't been subject to a lot of competition or, even being pointed to as a coven. I have had that in my work, however, right? Like She Writes Press has been called negative things for being female only. But I think I don't operate from a scarcity mentality, right? And so that's probably part of why I don't experience that in my friendships. But that said, yes, women get stereotyped, so do men, right? I mean, we all do to some extent. But I think that women in particular are supposed to fit into these really small preordained boxes. And I'm sure you remember when the Barbie movie came out and America Ferrera's speech was making the rounds on memes and on lines. And it was good, but it also wasn't groundbreaking at all. It's like, I've heard this. Yes, we all know. And it's also always been the case that women can be too fill in the blank. We're too much, to this, to that. And when I was young, I got an earful a lot. When I remember explicitly being in my 20s, being dinged for being bitchy, when really I would just be doing things like not smiling, or in a work environment where I didn't want to just shoot the shit with people. People would stop by and I'd be like, I'm working, and I kind of got a reputation for being a little harsh. And I was like, I'm just being honest, So I think that's just an interesting thing about how women are put into kind of containers, but ultimately we need each other in this world so much, so I've tried to be a lifter upper with friends, and I don't always succeed, of course, but Grant, I know that friendship is a real pet topic of yours, so I'm not surprised that you plucked this essay out, and I'm curious what insights you found here, about what Nicole had to say about friendship.
Yeah, it is kind of a pet and growing obsession of mine. And I loved her essay on friendship because it made me think a lot about the differences between female friends and male friends. And I say that because this essay is really a celebration of a friend, almost a type of love letter. And in fact, Nicole spends a paragraph or two explaining that their connection isn't romantic. It's just extremely and wonderfully close. I thought it was interesting that she felt the need to make that or give that context. But the description of the friend, it is so loving and intimate and so touching. And I hate to say it, but I think very few men could have or would have been motivated to write such a piece, and that it really, unpeeled the nuances of a friendship and so thoughtfully told their story. And I recently read an essay by Brian Benson the whole essay was about his awkward fit in a vacation that was an all men vacation. And it really highlighted a lot of awkward moments I've also experienced in that situation, and how men so often rely on activities as the center of their friendships instead of, having more intimate conversations, I mean, not entirely, but it made me just think of patterns of behavior and how hard it can be to alter them when they're so embedded and supported by our culture. And Nicole, I appreciated her kind of just basic approach to these essays. She said that she was always working out a dilemma in each essay, and she wasn't necessarily arriving or even wanting to arrive at the final answer. And that's their beauty, is that her collection is a search. It's an attempt to solve a problem or problems. So I look forward to solving some problems with her in person after this short break. Welcome back, everybody. I'm excited to introduce Nicole Graev Lipson, who is the author of the Memoir-in-Essays, Mothers and Other Fictional Characters. Her writing has been awarded a Pushcart Prize, selected for the Best American Essays Anthology, and shortlisted for a National Magazine Award. Her work has appeared in a whole bunch of fantastic, prestigious literary magazines like The Sun, the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Gettysburg Review, Creative Nonfiction, Fourth Genre, the Washington Post, and the Washington Globe, among other publications. And Nicole holds a BA from Cornell University and an MFA from Emerson College. And she's originally from New York City, but she lives outside of Boston in Brookline right now with her family. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me, Grant and Brooke. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, it's a treat for us to talk with you. And to start, we've had several guests on the podcast who have talked about their life experiences through a kind of a fictional or a storytelling lens. For example, recently, Lydia Yuknevich came on the show to talk about her memoir, which dealt with what she calls shape-shifting, which in her terms means kind of recasting or reframing stories that she's carried with her throughout her life to understand them in a different way and to position them in a different way. And I love your title, Mothers and Other Fictional Characters, because it gets at that nature of self. It's an invitation to think about how we're at least partly made up, by ourselves and others, and the roles or identities we feel aren't static or finished. So I'm just curious, how did you land on the title, and when did you start to think of your experiences as a mother, a daughter, a wife, and a woman as a fictional character?
Such a good question. I mean, the title took me a while, actually, to land on. I went through several terrible titles before I landed on this title. But the essays started, I began writing them when I still had quite young children. And what drew me to the page was this feeling that after I became a mother, I was often both myself and not myself, that I had stepped into this character of mother with a capital M, with all of the sort of expectations and assumptions and associations that role has. And I began writing these pieces originally a standalone essays that I wrote almost out of desperation, out of a way to use the writing to sort of almost like knots on a rope to sort of grasp my way back to myself. And after I'd written a few of these, I began to realize that even though on the surface they weren't about exactly the same thing, one was about my struggle to determine what to do with 3 frozen embryos left over from a round of IVF, and another was about my sudden, strangely powerful attraction to a younger man in the midstream of an otherwise happy, healthy marriage. Another one was about raising daughters in the swirl of our culture's beauty expectations. And even though they were quite different, I began to realize that they were all circling around the same central question, which was where fiction begins and truth ends when one is a woman. And while it was the fiction of motherhood, the mother fiction that led me to the page, I really began to think about how that template of womanhood is just one in a series of templates that women and girls confront over the course of the female lifespan. I mean, even girl with a capital G is a sort of template. There is sort of a proper way to be a girl in our culture. And once you graduate from girlhood, move on to young adult womanhood, which is the options there are sort of like the ingenue or the sex object, these very limited templates of acceptable female existence. And so I was really interested in exploring all of those and cracking through them, and very much what you describe Lydia Yuknavitch doing too, it sounds like, in terms of taking these stories that I'd worn for so long that they were almost like clothes I'd fallen asleep in, like they were just part of the story I told about myself, and really peeling away at them to see what was pulsing underneath.
Thanks for that, Nicole. That's a great segue for my next question, because in your essays, you're writing about your son and your gender nonconforming child, and mother, of course, isn't the only fictional character, like you said. So are girl, but also boy, man, woman. And your essay, As They Like It, is about learning to understand your child's gender nonconformity. And it tackles some really sensitive material, I think, in a very honest way. And one of the most compelling parts of the essay for me was the immense vulnerability that I can only imagine it must have taken to write and publish it. As you yourself note in the essay, you're hesitant about publicly giving voice to some of these thoughts. I related to this a lot because I've actually kind of postponed my own memoir because of my concerns about my son reading my story at his age. So could you talk more about how it felt to write such a vulnerable essay, especially since some of the people who appear in your essays will probably read them?
Yeah. So, there's a writing adage to write what scares you.
Yeah.
And writing that essay, As They Like It, I went far beyond that. I was writing what really terrified me, what made me truly nauseous with fear. And what I feared wasn't confronting my own feelings and my own experience. I had been confronting that and grappling with that for a while. But what I feared was being misunderstood and sort of being possibly willfully misunderstood by some in the reading of that essay. And in wading into the territory of kids and gender, especially when I began writing that essay, I think things have changed slightly. But when I began writing that essay, it's hard to think of more polarizing topics in our culture. And when I began to observe my oldest child migrating from a female identity, the identity of a girl, toward the identity of a boy, I had never had that experience before. None of us as parents really have the experiences that we've had, that we're having before. We aren't born parents the moment we have children. We become parents in the parenting. And so I had a lot of questions. I was really trying to understand what this transformation meant for my child and how to best parent them through it. My job being to keep them safe, to help guide them, to, be a sounding board. And so I did what I often do when I'm confused about something. I tried to read. I tried to find voices of people who might be going through similar things, to find kindred spirits in the world, other parents perhaps who were witnessing their child exploring gender and had questions or confusion about it, or were trying to get their footing in some way. But every first person piece by a parent that I could find that grappled with these questions, most of them were op-eds in the service of a particular political stance, almost like a politicized stance. And most of them fell on sort of barbelled ends of a spectrum. And I didn't relate to either of these barbelled ends of the spectrum. I really had lots of ambivalent feelings. I had confusion. And so not finding those kindred spirits in the things I was reading, I decided to write into it myself. And I didn't know at first whether I would pursue publishing it, but I really was writing that essay almost like a hand reaching out in the dark to other families going through this to say, are you feeling this way too? Am I alone in this sort of struggle to get my footing, to not know exactly how to orient myself to these changes going on in my child?
Well, Nicole, one role that a lot of artists struggle with as parents is actually doing their art. And my wife is a writer, and I think our worst arguments somehow centered on this, who got writing time and when, especially when our kids were young. And I used to joke that no one had ever seen our entire family together because one of us was always kind of handing the caretaker baton to the other and then dashing away. And I love your comment on the relationship between selfhood and motherhood when you say that they might be entirely incompatible callings. And that's a good way to put it. And you probe these questions, especially, in the essay, A Place or a State of Affairs. So I'd love for you to talk more about how a parent makes a time and place for themselves without guilt, or if that's possible. I now wish I would have been more present for my kids, actually, now that they're more grown up.
Oh, it sort of gives me a pang in my heart to hear that. Yeah, I think that there is this problem, especially when I felt it mostly when my kids were a little younger, of even when I did claim solitude for myself, even when I did take the occasional weekend away, which I sort of, that was my approach. I almost took these stretches of binge writing because it was so hard for me to get writing in as a daily practice. That always under the surface, there was sort of a gnawing feeling of guilt or regret. That was always sort of there. And I think that's, for me, that's just been the continual condition, truthfully, of being both a parent and a writer. But I was just thinking about this recently, actually, because here I am, I'm on book tour right now for my book. I'm doing this interview from a hotel room. And I've been thinking about how my orientation to solitude is an away time from my family feels slightly different now than it did when my children were younger. And I had this feeling, because they're more independent, because they can fend for themselves in a lot of ways now that they couldn't when they were younger. My feeling is less of guilt. I was trying to pinpoint it. It was more almost wistfulness that they don't need me in the same way. Like, it was almost before the discomfort was in feeling that I was failing them in some way. And now the discomfort feels like my own sadness in their growing older. But it's just a reminder that nothing stays the same. The patterns and the habits that we have in one moment, or what it takes to access solitude or work time, isn't static. It changes over time, depending on our lives, our partnerships, our children's ages. And And so I'm trying to appreciate the greater leeway I have now than I did when my children were younger.
Well, Nicole, we recently did a show where we talked about Miranda July's All Fours, and we did that because it's this zeitgeist book and because it raises so many questions about how to be fulfilled sexually and creatively as a mother, wife, and a woman. And such questions hang over your collection through your mother's affair. In your opening essay, Kate Chopin, My Mother and Me, you recount the fallout of your mother's affair and your parents' subsequent divorce. And you do this with a certain empathy afforded by time, but you also write about the anger you feel when you think about your mother's affair. You write, "The fierceness of my love for my children has filled me at times with rage as I wonder in a new way how my mother could have betrayed us as she did." And so I'm curious if you could talk about how you resolve these tensions, write about these tensions, and how these subjects play into this collection.
So, I mean, I think with that essay and with almost all the essays, if I think about them, they are grappling with some sort of confusion. They start with confusion, and I'm drawn to the topic because I have this desire to sort things out once and for all. And writing through that essay, which is about sort of looking at the affair my mother had when I was in high school and juxtaposing it with the short story The Storm by Kate Chopin, and then my own finding myself with my own extramarital longings later in life, I ended up really pondering how, I even write it in the essay, that truth is it's kaleidoscopic, that truth is always shifting and shifting depending on our stance and where we are in life. Because, surrounding that line you just read where I said, thinking about my mother's affair has filled me with rage, I think a sentence before that, I say, that she has been a bold pioneer, right? Rebelling against the expectations of her era, that she's been selfless because she stayed married to my father for many years through unhappiness because she didn't want to destroy the marriage, right? So there's so many ways to look at the same set of facts. And I think that writing that essay didn't necessarily help me come to some sort of moment where I was like, Eureka! I now understand everything and it's all clear to me and I know how to proceed. But writing it did make me a little bit more comfortable in the multiplicity of that experience. And again, I think I could say that for all the essays, that the writing of them doesn't answer questions for me fully, but the writing helps me get maybe ever so closer to clarity, just a few steps closer to clarity. And at the very least, makes me feel a little bit more comfortable resting in confusion.
I love that, Nicole. It reminds me so much of Montaigne, that the essay is an attempt to understand, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a beautiful way to put it. I want to ask about reading, and I've heard Joyce Carol Oates describe a person's memoir that is grounded in books and reading as a bibliomemoir. And I read an interview with you where you described this book as a bibliomemoir as well. And I think that's so interesting for a reader because you bring the world of literature you just mentioned Kate Chopin, had a very prominent place in that essay. And then there's Shakespeare and Maya Angelou and Franz Kafka and others. So I'm just curious if that was conscious or is just reading so prominent with you that it just seamlessly enters your essays?
So a little bit of both, but mostly the latter. I think for anyone who is an avid reader, who maybe grew up as a bookworm, spends a lot of time reading, the boundary between reading life and quote unquote real life can feel really porous. You spend a lot of time in a book. I find that what I'm reading colors how I see the world when I look up from that book, and then how I'm moving through the world or what I'm experiencing in the days that I'm reading a book colors how I'm reading that book when I return to it. So it's like this very thin veil between the two. And also I've often thought of Like when I read some books that include research or cite research or outside texts, very often that material comes in almost like from on high, like you're hearing the writer's perspective and then suddenly somebody is quoted. And I always wonder, well, how did they come upon this quote? Or, is this an author that they read all the time and love, or did they research this quote? Because reading is like a very embodied thing, right? It's not only this disembodied knowledge that comes to us. So very often in the process of writing these essays, I was also reading. And like so often happens, right? When life becomes almost like a series of synchronicities, you're reading one thing and then it weirdly connects to some experience you've just had. And then that triggers a memory of another piece of writing that you remember a relevant quote from. That would happen to me a lot as I was writing the essays. And so it almost was an organic process of incorporating that part of my life into the descriptions on the page.
That's so interesting. I'm curious too about how the collection came together, because a collection of essays can be read as a type of memoir, yet they're generally written as standalone pieces. So when did you decide to publish this as a collection? I'm curious. You actually mentioned they were written as standalone pieces. So I guess that's the question. When did you realize you had a collection?
Yeah, it was really after I'd written about 3 or 4, and I did start to see that thread, that theme of the ways that women can kind of stand teetering between fiction and truth. And I wanted to explore that more. And that's when I began to see perhaps there was a project with a larger scope in the essays. And then that informed what I wrote. So I really wanted to explore the course of the female lifespan. I think my book moves chronologically in 2 ways. It moves chronologically in the sense that the earlier essays are focused more on experiences from my own girlhood as the starting place, or things that are relevant to younger girls in our culture and beauty standards and female friendship and all of these sort of early influences. And then in the middle, it moves towards motherhood and sort of essays that grapple with motherhood in different ways. And then moves in the end toward essays that contemplate life as a middle-aged woman and what does that template look like. And it even ends with an essay, Memento Mori, which is a contemplation of mortality. So I really started to see the arc as this arc of the female lifespan. And then naturally too, because my family was growing and my children were growing, as I wrote the essays, there developed this sort of natural narrative arc of following my and my family's journey through younger childhood, up until my oldest is a preteen when the book ends.
Nicole, in closing, I once heard someone say that they read to feel gentleness. And when it comes down to it, I think I read to feel intimacy. And I definitely try to aspire to create intimacy when I write. And a while back, maybe a year ago, we had Stacey Durasmo on the show who'd written The Art of Intimacy. So it's a subject I'm very kind of obsessed about. And a review in the Rumpus remarked about you. They said, every anecdote is told with grace, clarity, and a kind of honesty you might expect from a conversation with a close friend, willing to tell you she feels like a monster some days and a MILF others. And so I'm curious, how do you create intimacy or closeness with the reader, which I definitely felt in your essays? Like, is it just through honesty and vulnerability alone, or are there other elements?
That's such a good question. I had a conversation with a fiction writer friend once, and he said to me, I never think about audience when I'm writing, because the moment I think about audience, I start to censor myself. I start to, freeze up. And that was so interesting to me because I'm the exact opposite. I constantly think about audience as I'm writing and trying to put myself in the shoes of who might be reading this book. And sometimes for me, that was picturing a particular person. Sometimes I was writing to my friend Sarah, who I have a whole essay about in the book, who's like my dearest woman friend. And so I thought, how would I write this if I was writing to my friend Sarah, if I was speaking to her? How would I want to hear these kind of admissions or vulnerable revelations delivered to me if I was a woman reader feeling the same thing, and wanting to feel that connection or that feeling of companionship? So I think I very much wanted the book from as soon as I started conceiving of it as a book, I wanted it to feel, reading it, almost exactly what that Rumpus review said, which is so thrilling to read. I really wanted it to feel like that moment of vulnerability between two friends when, perhaps you're a little nervous to offer something up, to make yourself vulnerable in some way, but you share some piece of yourself. And the hope, when you share that piece of yourself with a friend, is that they're going to absorb it and that they're going to hold it and that they're not going to be shocked. They're not going to reject it. And that maybe, just maybe, they'll respond with something like, yes, I have felt that way too. And so I wanted that to be the feeling in the reader as much as I could control, how readers responded. And so I think, revealing truths with gentleness, and also never avoiding making anything prescriptive. So I think that sometimes it can be off-putting for readers if it seems like what you are writing is a way of telling them they should live their lives that way too. Like, I have figured out the answers and this is the way to be, this is the way to live. And I really have very few opinions about how other people should live their lives. And that's not the intention of memoir, right? Even though I think sometimes people mistake the intention for that. I really just wanted to almost put the words out as an offering, like a gentle offering.
It's a great description of how to create intimacy on the page in a nutshell, a gentle offering. So thank you so much for that and all of your wisdom and the book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thanks for being on with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
We'll be right back with today's Substackin'.
Brooke, for this week's Substack, and I wanted to mention one of my pieces that I published, and I offer this because Nicole's collection of essays and the peeling back of stereotypes and societal expectations that she did to essentially hear herself, it requires a certain type of meditative exploration. And I think that exploration requires a silence to hear your true self. And I mentioned this because I wrote a series of what I call creative meditations several years ago, just very short pieces on creativity or subjects related to creativity. And I wanted to collect them into a book of 365 meditations, but I didn't find a publisher for that one. I have been publishing the occasional meditation on my Substack, though. I just started doing this, and I just published one on silence. So Brooke, one of my observations about silence is how most of us don't seek it out, and we might even be afraid of it. So I'm curious, when you're out for a walk or a jog, do you put in earbuds or move with the silence?
Yeah, I'm busted on this topic. I am always listening to something. It's very funny because recently I was listening to a podcast that I like called The Bitchuation Room, and the host just fully called it out, like sarcastically, kind of lightly mocking the audience. But she was essentially saying, like, I need content, what are you even talking about being like not listening to content, being in silence for more than 90 seconds? No, why? Right. Mm-hmm. And she was kind of prodding the audience to be like, of course. And that is how I am. It's like, if I'm working, I am totally in silence. I'm very, very absorbed and focused, but I run with my AirPods. I walk with my AirPods. I listen to my podcasts in the car. Do I feel uncomfortable in total silence? I don't know. It's like, I think probably a lot of people relate to this. Like it just feels like someone is keeping you company. I also think that I'm supposed to be doing something and at least like taking in the content. I think keeps us in a suspended feeling of like something is actually happening. And I've always been that way. Like I remember waking up in my college dorm and turning on the news first thing. I listen to podcasts in the shower, so I am the worst. Like I am not cultivating silence. So I don't know, but the good news is I guess I don't feel bad about it.
That's good. That's good.
How about you?
I feel as busted as you are, and I feel like I have been feeling a little bad about it, actually. Like I did a kind of audit of my own life when I published that piece, and I always listen to music like you when I'm exercising, and when I walk our dog, I tend to listen to a podcast. So I've recently challenged myself to not listen to anything while I walk, and if I give it time and if I'm intentional about it, I'll start to get lost in the sounds in the neighborhood, especially the birds. But still, every morning I have to fight off the temptation to be entertained during my walk. So yeah, that's when I start feeling bad about it. But I make the point in my piece that, to make art, we must find the space for quiet and to become intimate with our own minds. And I highlight this quote from Thomas Merton, the poet and Trappist monk, who said that people need silence in their lives to, quote, enable the deep inner voice of their own true self to be heard, at least occasionally. And when that voice isn't heard, he says, we're essentially exiled from our home. And so I've been really thinking about that. And it reminded me a bit of some of your friend Mark Nepo's thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. If any of you want to experience the opposite of what I just shared, the wonderful Mark Nepo has a lot to say about silence, and I think he's better at silence than most. One of his quotes reads, "Never assume the song is gone because it's found its source in silence." Really beautiful. Silence holds stories, in other words, and we hold stories as well, regardless of, how we take in content, sit in silence or don't sit in silence. And we just want you to tell your story. And we're excited to be finding more and better ways to do just that with Memoir Nation. So please keep tuning in every week. Stay posted on what we have going on over there and over here. memoir-nation.com is live, so go poke around, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.